Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown, and he watched her bury evidence. A fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. She buried evidence. He watched. She didn't know he was watching when she dragged the bloodied bundle across the orchard floor, her hands trembling and her breath catching like a confession caught in the throat of a guilty woman. She thought the fog was thick enough. She thought the night was silent. She thought no one would see her bury the evidence beneath the old yew tree. But Father Brown had seen everything. It had started with a scream, just one, and short, too sudden for panic, too sharp for warning. The villagers of Bletcham hung their heads and shut their doors, as they always did when darkness arrived before the bells. But not Father Brown. He had been standing at the gate of St. Mary's, coat buttoned against the mist, eyes narrowed toward the distant shape moving just beyond the gravestones. Something had compelled him to stay, perhaps the unnatural stillness of the birds or the way the air seemed to curl around the church like a held breath. Then, out of the fog, he saw her. She moved with a frantic purpose, as though her very soul were unraveling in her footsteps. Lady Evelyn Marchmont, elegant, revered, untouchable. And yet there she was, barefoot and wild-eyed, dragging something wrapped in a painter's canvas, her silken nightdress stained in dark, spreading rings. Father Brown did not move. He did not speak. He only watched, for he knew that truth, like a corpse, could only be exhumed when one dared to look at what others buried. The next morning, the village carried on as if the night had not coughed up its secrets. Children laughed, farmers cursed at the clouds, and Lady Evelyn arrived to Mass as if her hands were not trembling beneath her gloves. But Father Brown noticed the cut on her left wrist, thin and clean, like a ribbon unraveling from guilt. He did not speak of what he saw. Not yet. He needed to know why, because the mystery wasn't that Lady Evelyn buried something. The mystery was what she believed needed burying. The whispers began, as they always did in Kembleford. Mrs. Dalrymple swore she saw a man slip through the hedgerow at midnight. The grocer claimed he heard a voice weeping behind the Marchmont estate. But no one could agree on what had happened. No one could name the crime. There was no body, no bloodstain, no report. And yet, a tension gripped the town like a hand around its throat. Father Brown, meanwhile, walked quietly, observed more than he spoke. He returned to the yew tree more than once, not to dig, but to listen. Beneath its roots, he could feel a silence too heavy to be soil. He waited for the truth to rise, and when it did, it came in pieces. The Marchmont housekeeper was the first to break. A single sentence, muttered half-mad in confession. She burned the rest, Father. The dress, the photograph. But he made her keep the glove. Father Brown asked no questions. He only offered a prayer, and left with a weight in his chest he could not yet name. But that night, the glove appeared, on the church steps, damp, mud-caked, and impossibly small, too small for Lady Evelyn, too small even for her grown daughter, Annabel. It belonged to a child, and it was embroidered with a single red letter, M. Father Brown stood with the glove in his hand long after the fog rolled in again. The mystery was no longer what Evelyn buried. The mystery was who had worn this glove and why she had kept it. What he uncovered next shattered even his iron resolve. The Marchmont estate had hosted a gathering just days before, the kind of high society event that glistened with champagne and laughter, but always reeked of something sour underneath. Photographs had been taken, and one, left behind in a pew by a careless guest, showed a detail no one had noticed before: a shadow, a shape behind the garden hedge, small, watching. Father Brown took it to the constable, but the man only laughed. "A smudge, Father, a trick of the light." But Father Brown had seen too much to believe in tricks. He went to Annabel next, the daughter who rarely spoke, who painted things she never explained. She offered him tea, but her eyes never met his. And on the easel behind her, he saw a painting, still wet, glistening. A woman standing beneath a yew tree, digging. The colors were smeared with desperation. The face of the woman in the painting, was it Evelyn or herself? Father Brown dared to ask. Annabel only replied, "I paint what I can't forget." That night, the earth gave up its secret. There was no thunder, no scream, just the slow, inevitable cracking of truth beneath pressure. Rain fell hard, and the yew tree trembled, and when the roots shifted, the canvas-wrapped object surfaced like a memory refused. Father Brown did not look away. He dug with his bare hands. Inside was no body, only a violin, shattered, strangled by its own strings, and a note written in childlike hand, "I'm sorry I played." The villagers would never know what it meant. The papers would never print it. But Father Brown stood in the church the next morning with a look on his face no one could explain. He had solved nothing, and yet everything had changed, because Evelyn came to him after service, lips pale, and whispered only one line: "He made me bury the sound, Father, not the child." And Father Brown, who had witnessed sins both grotesque and beautiful, suddenly understood. But he would never speak it aloud, because the sound of guilt, once buried, becomes louder than any scream. And still, someone was watching. Behind the final pew, a figure too still to be casual, eyes fixed on the altar. When Father Brown turned to face them, they were already gone. But on the seat where they had sat lay another glove, smaller still. Not red this time, not embroidered, but wet, fresh, and left deliberately. Father Brown said nothing. He simply knelt and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The bells began to ring, and the fog swallowed the village whole. Chapter 2. Father Brown's eyes saw everything. The first time she slit the photograph open, right through the child's face, Father Brown was watching from the confessional, and his hands never stopped shaking for 3 days. It began with a funeral no one wanted to attend. A closed casket, a name spoken too softly, and mourners, who arrived out of obligation, not grief. Rain beat against the stained glass windows of St. Mary's as if the heavens were trying to wash away what had been, buried below. And yet, inside the church, the silence was far more deafening. Something was wrong, something far older than death. Father Brown knew it the moment they lowered the casket, not because of what was inside, but because of who had refused to look. Margaret Ellison sat in the back pew, gloves on despite the heat, hat tilted too low. The villagers had whispered for weeks about the reclusive widow who returned after 20 years abroad, bringing with her only a locked valise and a teenage niece who never spoke. But Father Brown had seen the way Margaret flinched when the hymns were sung. He had noticed the soot stains beneath her nails and the peculiar scent of bleach that clung to her veil. And most of all, he had noticed the absence of something fundamental, the absence of mourning. She was not sad, she was afraid. The deceased, by all appearances, had died of heart failure, a simple tragedy. But Father Brown knew too much of human nature to believe in simple deaths. Not when there were hands that trembled without reason. Not when a child flinched from her guardian's voice as if each syllable were a strike. He had watched the girl, Clara, during the service. She never cried. She stared ahead, eyes fixed on the altar, as though trying to remember something she had been ordered to forget. Later that evening, as Father Brown returned to the vestry, he found something that did not belong. A photograph slid beneath the church door. It had been sliced in half. A family portrait, dated 1899. On one side, a man with kind eyes. On the other, Margaret. But the child in the middle, her face was cut away entirely, the edges singed. Father Brown held the photo in his trembling hands and whispered a prayer not for the dead, but for the living. He showed the photo to no one. Not yet. Instead, he began to walk the village more often, slower, more deliberately, as though truth could be coaxed out of cobblestone. And truth, in its usual way, began to surface in fragments. A maid at the Ellison estate had left in the dead of night, screaming. No one knew why. She had torn the curtains from the windows and carved something into the pantry door. A single word. Beneath. The local physician confessed, over a stiff drink, that the body in the casket had been colder than expected. Stone cold, he muttered, as if it had been dead for days, not hours. And Clara, the girl with no tears, was seen in the churchyard at dawn, her nightgown soaked, whispering into the stone mouth of an old broken angel. Father Brown remained silent. He watched, and he listened, because watching, he knew, was not the same as seeing. And there was something he had seen weeks earlier that refused to leave him. Margaret, in the confessional, whispering not sins, but instructions. The fire must never reach the cellar. If it does, they'll know what we kept. At the time, he had thought it nonsense, the kind of fraying madness that often accompanied grief. But now he wasn't so sure, because something had been burned. He could smell it beneath her perfume, and something had been hidden far deeper than any coffin. The Ellison house was old, built atop older stone. The cellar, he learned, had been sealed for decades. Not bricked, not bolted, sealed, as if what lay beneath should never again see daylight. And it wasn't Margaret who had sealed it. It was her husband, the man in the photograph. He had died in a fire, supposedly trying to rescue a servant, but the details were inconsistent. Records vanished, and Father Brown found a page torn from a diary tucked between the Psalms in an abandoned Bible in the rectory. A single line. She said, "The child must forget, but the walls do not." That night, Father Brown stood before the Ellison estate in the rain and rang the bell. No answer. He rang again. Still, no answer. He was about to leave when he saw it. A light in the cellar window, flickering, unsteady, like the glow of a candle being carried by a hand that trembled. The next morning, the housekeeper was found unconscious on the kitchen floor. Clara was gone. The village erupted in panic. The constable organized a search party. Margaret claimed the girl had simply run away, but Father Brown said nothing. He already knew where she had gone, because he had seen something others had missed. The photograph. Not the cut in it, but the background. A mirror. And in the mirror behind the family was a door. A door that did not exist anywhere in the current house, unless you counted what was beneath. He returned to the church, alone, and descended into the crypts. They hadn't been used in years. Not since the war. But he had to know. And what he found stopped his heart for a full 6 beats. Carved into the stone floor was the same word the maid had, written beneath, and next to it, laid gently as though by a child's hand, was Clara's music box, still playing, a slow, distorted version of Hush Little Baby. He opened it. Inside was a tooth, a small one, with blood still fresh. Father Brown staggered backwards, not from fear, but from something worse, recognition, because he had seen this before, a pattern, a ritual, and it meant only one thing. This was not Clara's tooth. He knew then that the cellar was not just a sealed room. It was a vault, a prison, a graveyard of memories someone had tried desperately to erase, and someone was still watching him. In the chapel the next evening, after Mass, a candle relit itself after being snuffed. No wind, no draught, just flame, as if ignited by will. Father Brown turned and saw Margaret standing in the rear aisle, eyes hollow, lips trembling. "I told him not to build it," she whispered, "but he said the voices would stop if we buried them. He said it wasn't murder if no one remembered." She took a step forward and placed something in Father Brown's hand. A lock of hair, 2 colors, twisted together, one gold, one black. "The girl in the casket," she said, "wasn't mine." And Father Brown felt something unholy stir within his soul. The bells rang too soon that night, and outside the church, Clara stood in the shadows, barefoot, watching him with eyes that were not hers. He looked at her, and she smiled. But it wasn't a child's smile. It was older, crooked, as though borrowed. Father Brown turned to the altar and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And somewhere, beneath the floorboards of the Ellison house, a door creaked open. Chapter 3. He knows what she buried. The moment she kissed the soil, whispering to it like a lover, Father Brown knew that she wasn't just burying something, she was feeding it. It was nearly midnight when the priest saw her moving through the trees beyond the old cemetery, her lantern swinging low like a guilty conscience. She thought no one could see her there, past the crumbling stone wall, where the grass grew too wild for graves and the ground was too soft to remember what it had swallowed. But Father Brown had been awake. Not by accident. He had felt the pull, as if something beneath the earth was calling for a witness. And he had come, quietly, without coat or shoes, following the light through the mist like a soul tempted by sin. He watched her dig. Her hands moved fast, like she'd done it before. Dirt piled beside her in fevered silence, and something wrapped in oilskin glinted beneath her skirts. But it wasn't the digging that unsettled him. It was the way she wept while she worked. Not from sorrow, not from fear, but from something deeper, something like relief, as if burying it meant she could breathe again. That's when he recognized her. Mrs. Louise Denham, the widow who had never mourned. Her husband had drowned a year ago, or so the report claimed. A tragic accident, a boating mishap. But Father Brown had always found it peculiar that no one had seen her weep at the funeral, no tremble in her voice, no black veil. She had simply watched the casket lower and asked if the garden gates could be unlocked again. And yet tonight, her tears fell like absolution. He did not stop her. He did not call out. He only watched, because he needed to know what she thought deserved burial, and why she did it when the moon was at its darkest. The next morning, he passed her in the village square. She smiled, polite, composed, a woman with nothing to hide, but he noticed the flecks of soil beneath her fingernails and the faint bruise on her wrist. And he noticed the silence between her and the grocer's boy, the one who had always carried her basket, as if a word had passed between them, too heavy to lift again. It began to unravel quickly. A child went missing that afternoon. A little girl from the orphanage, seen last near the churchyard. No screams, no blood. Just her ribbon, red, satin, damp, found beneath the bell tower steps. No one had seen her leave. No one had seen her enter. It was as if she had simply vanished into the air, except Father Brown knew better. He returned that night to the place Louise had dug. The soil was damp but disturbed, as if something had been added or removed. And there, not buried but pressed into the bark of a tree nearby, was the same ribbon, twisted into a strange symbol, a shape he recognized, one that had been carved into the margin of a page from a forbidden book in the monastery years ago. A symbol for silence, made flesh. What had she buried? A body? A secret? A promise? Father Brown's heart pounded with the weight of what he could not yet name. He visited Louise the next day. She greeted him warmly, too warmly, as if she feared coldness would reveal the truth. "I've been planting dahlias," she said, gesturing to the garden. "They bloom best in quiet places." He asked about the child. She blinked. "I heard she ran away." He said nothing, only looked at her hands, scrubbed clean now, too clean. That night he dreamt of the girl, not as a ghost, but as a shadow pressed against glass, trying to scream with no mouth. He awoke at dawn and went to the church. A figure was already there, waiting, the grocer's boy. He didn't speak, just placed something in Father Brown's hand and ran. It was a brooch, simple, silver, in the shape of a bird. But Father Brown had seen it once before, in a photograph on Louise's mantle. It had belonged to her husband. A gift, she had said, on their anniversary. And now it was wrapped in cloth, blood-stained. He returned to the cemetery, dug where she had dug. The soil came up easy, and soon his hands touched the edge of something wrapped in oilskin. He opened it. Inside was not a body, not even a part of one, but something worse. A doll, hand-stitched. Its eyes were sewn shut. Its mouth was stitched open and tucked into its chest cavity. A letter. He opened it carefully. The ink was smudged, the handwriting frantic. "If you're reading this, it means she's buried me twice. Once in memory, once in flesh." There was no name, no date, but the meaning screamed. He brought the letter to Louise that same evening, said nothing, just let her read it. She laughed, a strange, brittle laugh, the kind that hides too much behind it. "I suppose even secrets have roots, Father." Then she burned the letter in front of him. "And," whispered, "the girl isn't missing. She's hiding. From what I buried. From what's still alive." Father Brown left the house trembling, because what she buried might not have been a person. It might have been a curse. and he wasn't sure it had stayed underground. The next day, the bell tower rang 13 times. No one had touched the rope. No one was inside. And beneath the pews, when Father Brown checked after evening mass, were muddy footprints, small, bare, leading up to the altar and vanishing mid-step. Clara, the youngest orphan, told him something before she fell asleep that night. "She talks to it," she said, "in the garden. The thing in the ground, she says, it listens." He asked who. She pointed at the dark, "The woman who smells like ash," and then she wept. By the end of the week, Louise was gone, disappeared. The house was locked from the inside. No signs of struggle, no farewell. Only one item left behind. The same brooch pinned to a child's dress. But the dress was too small for any of the girls in the orphanage, too small for anyone still alive. Father Brown never spoke of what he knew, not to the constable, not to the bishop, not even to himself. But he kept the doll. He kept it locked in a box. And sometimes, late at night, he heard it breathing. When asked if the girl was ever found, he would only say, "I know what she buried, but some graves are deeper than they look." Then he would close his eyes and pray for the soil. Chapter 4. The Priest Who Watched Murder. He didn't scream, didn't move, didn't even pray. He just stood there, still as the dead, while the knife slipped into the woman's throat, and her eyes begged him to stop it. It happened in the north transept of the church, beneath the stained glass window of St. Bartholomew, his flayed skin forever frozen in vibrant crimson. A Sunday evening, rain pattered gently against the ancient stones, and the congregation had already gone. The candles flickered low. The incense had long since burned out, and yet Father Brown had remained. Something had told him not to leave. A pressure behind his eyes, a heaviness in the floorboards beneath his feet. Then came the sound, barely audible, but enough to make his breath catch. A whimper, a breath, a word half-spoken and never finished. He turned the corner, past the baptismal font, and through the iron arch, and there it was. A man standing over a woman, blade in hand, motionless, intent, and she saw him. She saw him, her eyes locked to his, not pleading for life, but for witness. And Father Brown, he froze. The knife came down, and the silence that followed was more violent than the act itself. But the killer did not run. He did not speak. He looked up, saw Father Brown watching, and tilted his head, calmly, as though greeting someone he expected to see. Then he walked away, vanished into the shadows of the vestry, leaving blood, like confession, on the cold stone floor. Father Brown moved only once the door slammed in the distance. He rushed to the woman's side, but it was too late. Her mouth moved once, forming a name, or maybe a curse, and then nothing. The body bled into the altar cloth. The silence stretched, and Father Brown sat back on his knees, whispering, "Lord, forgive me. I saw it all." The next day, the police found nothing. No weapon, no footprints, no signs of struggle, no body. The church had been cleaned, impossibly so. Even the blood had vanished from the stone, as if the murder itself had been erased by unseen hands. Only Father Brown remembered, and he could not prove a thing. The diocese sent a physician, said he was overtired, grief-stricken, hallucinating from solitude. But he knew what he saw. He knew it happened, because every time he blinked, he saw her eyes again, staring at him, accusing, asking why. He searched the parish records, looked through photographs, interviewed everyone who'd attended service that day. No one saw her arrive. No one saw her leave. She wasn't on any list, not even in the visitor's log. The woman in the red scarf. He'd never seen her before, and yet something in her face felt hauntingly familiar. Then came the message, left in the confessional, scrawled in wax across the velvet. You watched. So now you must remember. That night, the church bells rang at midnight. No one had pulled the rope. The entire village heard it, woke to it. Some said it was the wind, others a prank. But Father Brown knew better. He descended into the crypt, lit a single candle. And there, beneath the broken statue of the Archangel, he found something no one could explain. A red scarf, still damp with blood, folded neatly, placed directly atop his Bible. He carried it back to the rectory, wrapped it in linen, and hid it beneath the floorboards. But it didn't stay hidden. Every night, it returned. To his desk, to the altar, to the pulpit, as if the memory refused to stay buried. Then the dreams began. The same woman walking the aisles of the church, dragging her fingers along the pews, whispers curling around her like smoke. Each dream ended the same way, with Father Brown screaming her name and waking up without knowing what it was. He began to question everything. Was it a vision, a test, a punishment? Or was he not the only one who had seen it? Because one evening, as he lit the final candle for Vespers, a child entered the church alone. A girl of no more than 10. Pale, dressed in grey. She said only one thing before turning and walking back into the night. She's still bleeding, Father. He followed, but she was gone. The next day, a grave was dug up in the cemetery. No sign of who did it, but the coffin inside had been split open, and inside it, no body, just a red scarf, and a mirror, cracked down the center, smeared with fingerprints. His own. The mirror was sent to the constabulary. Disappeared before analysis. No file was opened. No one questioned him, because no one believed a murder had occurred, except one. An elderly woman from the choir, Miss Bertram, deaf in one ear, claimed to have stayed behind in the church that night to find her lost shawl. She approached Father Brown after service, eyes full of fear, and said, "I saw her too. She smiled at me, but her mouth was too wide. Too wrong. I don't think she was ever alive." Father Brown asked her what she meant. She trembled. The man who killed her? He wasn't holding a knife. He was holding a crucifix that night. Father Brown tore apart the vestry, and he found it, tucked behind the hymnals. A crucifix, twisted, broken at the arms, and engraved on the back, in memory of Sister Magdalene. But there had never been a Sister Magdalene in the parish, not in any records, not in any graves, only a faded painting in the hallway outside the library of a nun, red scarf, pale skin, painted in 1883, and someone had gouged out her eyes. From that night on, the parish changed. Candles blew themselves out. The organ played without touch, and Father Brown found blood on the altar cloth every morning, no matter how many times he washed it. Finally, on the 7th night, he returned to the spot where it happened, and waited. She came. She always came. But this time, she spoke, not aloud. In his mind, a whisper that curdled the soul. You watched. So now, you must remember. Say my name, Father. But he couldn't. Because the truth, the one that shattered his soul, was this. He had seen her die once before. Long ago, in another parish. A scandal buried in silence. A cover-up the church insisted never happened. A sister accused of blasphemy, cast out, left to die. And now she had returned to make him remember, to make him watch again. And as the bells tolled 13 once more, Father Brown whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The candle went out, and her shadow never left the church again. Chapter 5. Buried clues beneath her feet. She danced across the ballroom floor, laughing as the string quartet played, all while the tiles beneath her feet hid the bones of the last woman who tried to expose the truth. No one noticed the pattern in her steps. No one heard the faint hollow tap that came only when she crossed a particular spot near the fireplace. No one saw the flicker of her eyes toward the corner where the chandelier's shadow didn't fall. But Father Brown did. He saw everything. The way her laughter seemed too bright, her shoes too silent, her charm too heavy. And he had already counted the steps. 13. Always 13. No matter how many turns she made in her waltz, her shoes fell 13 times before she paused, directly above something. The Bishop-Le Gala was meant to be a celebration, a night of grace, gowns, and goodwill for the church's newest hospital wing. But for Father Brown, it had become something else entirely. The letter had arrived that morning, unsigned, creased, and water-stained, as if it had passed through hands too frightened to keep it long. Only 4 words were written in hurried ink. "She is hiding everything." The handwriting was tight, almost manic. But what chilled him was the postscript. A single line. "It's beneath her." He attended the gala not in joy, but in grim readiness. He knew who she was the moment he entered. Lady Agatha Langthorne, patroness, philanthropist, widow of 3 years, known for her white gloves, her silver hair, and her unshakable poise. She moved through the guests like a ghost of privilege, always smiling, never sweating. But her eyes had that peculiar emptiness, the kind Father Brown had seen in others who buried things too terrible to carry. As the evening wore on, he remained still by the side doors, watching her movements. Always 13 steps, always the same pause. He slipped away, not to avoid conversation, but to trace the floor's shape from underneath, down into the unused wine cellar below the ballroom, where only dust and cobwebs remained. The ceiling was solid stone, except in one spot. A small rectangle of wood, newer than the rest, a hatch. He knocked once. It echoed like a drum over a tomb. When he returned upstairs, the gala was nearing its end. Champagne was dwindling. The musicians were packing up. Lady Langthorne was standing by the grand piano, accepting compliments, like roses. Father Brown approached her with his usual gentle calm. She smiled. He bowed. And softly he said, "What's beneath the floor, my lady?" Her smile froze, only for a second, but that second changed everything. She recovered quickly. "Oh, Father," she laughed, "surely you don't mean to ruin a perfectly good party with ghost stories." But ghosts were already rising, especially the kind you dress in silk and bury under parquet floors. That night, he returned with lantern in hand, alone. The hatch opened easily, no lock, just a heavy iron ring. The wood creaked as he pulled it open, revealing a narrow shaft descending into dark. A ladder, dusty but solid, and at the bottom, something else. A room, small, unfinished, and dry, too dry, like it hadn't breathed in decades. The smell hit him first, not rot, but paper. old ink, and beneath that, something coppery. There was a trunk in the corner, locked, a single chair, a broken rosary, and on the wall, carved by something blunt and furious, the words, "I told the truth. Father Brown didn't open the trunk. Not yet." He lit a candle and scanned the room. Scratches on the walls. Blood dried in a fingerprint pattern. No body, no bones, but the presence was undeniable. A rage trapped in dust. The next morning, the housekeeper at the Langthorne estate collapsed in the garden. A seizure. The doctor called it nerves, but before she lost consciousness, she repeated one line. "Don't let her step there again. Not again. Not on her." Father Brown returned to the cellar that night. The trunk was gone, no sign of tampering, no footprints, but in the middle of the room, a single shoe, high-heeled, silver, stained at the toe, and Lady Langthorne vanished. No carriage was taken, no luggage packed, her room untouched. Only the ballroom remained disturbed. One tile cracked, the same spot she had always paused upon. When the constable arrived, Father Brown showed him everything. The hatch, the room, the carvings. The constable laughed. "There's nothing here but wine racks and imagination, Father." Because the hatch had sealed itself, the wood was now stone, unbroken, as if it had never existed. But the shoe was still in his hand. And that evening, the bishop's secretary found a photograph in her drawer, one that hadn't been there before. Black and white, dated 1923. Lady Langthorne, younger, smiling, standing with another woman, unknown, in front of the Langthorne estate. But someone had scratched out the woman's face and written beneath it, in trembling ink, she knew what was under her feet. Father Brown took the photograph and placed it beside the shoe. They didn't match. Different eras, different women, same spot on the floor, same dance, same number of steps, 13. He went to the parish archives, tracing land, records. The Langthorne estate had once been a school, a girls' school, closed abruptly in 1925. No reason listed, no files kept, except one. A letter from the headmistress, unread, misfiled, written in ink almost too faded to decipher. She vanished in the ballroom, right before my eyes, as if the floor swallowed her. No scream, just silence. I tried to report it, but they said it was grief. And beneath the signature, Agatha, not Lady Agatha Langthorne, Headmistress Agatha, the same woman. No mention of a title or marriage, just a signature. And a seal, one belonging to an order of nuns. Excommunicated in 1931. Father Brown didn't sleep that night, because he realized something horrifying. The woman dancing at the gala wasn't pretending to be Lady Langthorne. She wasn't Lady Langthorne at all. She was wearing her, and the woman buried beneath her. She had never stopped screaming. Only now, the scream had learned to smile. The last time anyone entered the ballroom, the chandelier collapsed. No one was hurt, but 13 shards of glass were found embedded in the floorboards. Exactly 13, and everyone pointed toward the same tile. The cracked one, the one Father Brown never stepped on again. And when asked why, he would only say, "There are clues beneath her feet. But the price of unearthing them is remembering who we buried to forget." And then he would walk away, counting each step, never reaching 13. Chapter 6. She hid it. He knew. She dug the hole with her bare hands, laughing through her sobs as blood dripped from her fingers, because whatever she was hiding had once whispered her name while she slept. Father Brown had seen a great many things buried in his time. Secrets, guilt, whole lives built on the quiet art of concealment. But nothing unsettled him more than watching Margaret Tillingham walk into the orchard at dusk with a shovel she didn't know how to hold and a bundle she wouldn't let anyone touch. He hadn't meant to see her. In fact, he had only come out to breathe the cool evening air and collect his thoughts after hearing confession from a dying man who claimed he once saw a face pressed against the inside of a grave. But fate, as it often does in Kembleford, had other plans. Margaret had always been known for her control, the type of woman who smiled while correcting you, who trimmed her hedges like a surgeon, who never wept at her husband's funeral, not even when they lowered his casket into the ground beside their stillborn daughter. She was steel, wrapped in silk. Until that night. She was muttering to herself as she dug a series of soft words, spoken not in prayer but repetition, a chant of panic and denial. And then the bundle, small, wrapped in an old lace curtain. Something stained the edges dark, something not quite red, not quite brown. Father Brown stepped back into the shadows before she could notice him. He didn't call out, he didn't stop her, because he knew she wasn't hiding a crime. She was hiding fear. The next day, she came to Mass as usual. Gloves on, smile perfect, but her hands trembled when she reached for the communion wafer. Father Brown offered her a silent blessing, his eyes never leaving hers. She nodded once, as though accepting more than just forgiveness. But beneath her calm, something was breaking. Something old. Something desperate. By Tuesday, the rumors began. A child's shoe had been found near the river, torn, burned. No one claimed it. No one came forward, and no child had been reported missing. Not yet. But Father Brown had seen enough in life to know that some children disappear long before they're ever noticed. He visited Margaret that afternoon. The garden smelled of lavender and bleach. She poured tea, made small talk, but when he asked how she was sleeping, her smile vanished. "They knock now," she said. "At the walls. At night." Father Brown asked who. She blinked slowly. "The ones I didn't tell." She said no more. That night, he returned to the orchard. The disturbed patch of soil had been covered again, this time with wildflowers. Too perfect, too recent. As he knelt beside them, he saw something poking through the dirt, a strand of lace, torn, wet, and beneath it, the corner of a photograph. He pulled it free. 3 people, a man, a woman, and a child. Their faces blurred, smeared as if the photo had been burned or soaked. But written on the back was a name, Elsie, and beneath that, "Tell Father Brown. He knows." The name hit him like cold water. Elsie had died 3 years earlier. A drowning, Margaret's niece, slipped into the lake on a summer evening. The body recovered 2 days later. Closed casket funeral. He remembered it clearly, because Margaret had refused to let him perform the final rites. She said Elsie hadn't believed. She said some deaths didn't need blessings. And now the girl's name had resurfaced, literally. The next morning, the bell tower rang by itself. 3 times, no wind, no hand on the rope, just sound, echoing, hollow. That same hour, a gardener found something buried in Margaret's compost heap, a music box, crushed, and inside it, a tooth, too small to be an adult's, and painted red, not blood, painted. Father Brown visited the dentist's office, quietly, discreetly. Yes, Elsie had a chipped incisor. The record was still on file. Yes, the mark was distinct. But no, the tooth had never been recovered after her death. Father Brown returned to Margaret's estate. She greeted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Before he could speak, she handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a single line, written in careful cursive. "It was never the girl I buried." She shut the door in his face. And 2 hours later, she was gone. No goodbye, no carriage, just an empty house. Only one item left behind: the photograph. The same one he had found. Except now, the child's face was visible. And it wasn't Elsie, it was Margaret. As a child, the man and woman beside her, not her sister and brother-in-law, but her own parents. The photo wasn't 3 years old, it was 30. He returned to the orchard, dug deep this time. The soil yielded slowly, wet, reluctant, and beneath the wild flowers, the bundle was still there. He opened it. It wasn't a body. It wasn't even human. It was a doll, mouth stitched shut, eyes burned out, stuffed with photographs, dozens of them, all with the same child, Margaret, over and over, in different clothes, different years. One had a handwritten caption, 1975. The first time she screamed. Father Brown stared at the doll, the photos, the broken music box. Then he heard it. A rustle behind him. A voice. Low. Guttural. "You weren't supposed to see." He turned, but no one was there. Only the orchard trees, swaying without wind. He left the doll on the altar the next morning, wrapped in linen. Surrounded by candles, he prayed, but no peace came, because that night the doll returned to the orchard, on its own, reburied, fresh soil, and a new photograph, this time of him, standing in the orchard, looking terrified, and scrawled across it in blood-red ink. "You know what she hid. Now you must forget it." But he couldn't. He never could. So when asked why the orchard remains unplanted to this day, why no child is allowed near it, why the music box sometimes plays on its own beneath the trees, Father Brown only says one thing: "I know what she hid, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 7. A Witness. Father Brown feared. She spoke only once, and what she said made Father Brown step backward, as if the voice had come not from her mouth, but from something buried inside the earth that had chosen her to speak through. They found her standing outside the chapel, just before sunrise, barefoot, covered in soil, eyes unblinking. No one knew who she was. No one recognized her. She looked young, no more than 12, but the way she moved, the way her gaze pinned every person who dared approach her, it was not the gaze of a child. It was too still, too knowing. And when Father Brown emerged, dressed in his mourning vestments, she turned to him as if she had been waiting her entire life for that moment. Then she said it. Just one line. 5 words that cracked something cold inside him. "I saw what you buried." He didn't respond. Couldn't. The world narrowed into that single instant. The way her voice didn't tremble. The way she stood, as if she had no shadow. For a man who had spent years comforting the dying, unmasking killers, and unraveling twisted knots of sin and secrecy, Father Brown had never once feared a witness. Until now. The girl refused to give her name. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak again. The constable tried to question her, but she remained silent. The local doctor examined her and found no physical injuries, only her feet, scraped and raw from walking on gravel and glass. Her clothes were torn, unfamiliar. Her skin smelled faintly of rose water and something else, something old, like mildew and candle wax, something you only smelled in sealed places where the dead had slept for too long. Father Brown watched her from the doorway of the rectory. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. He knew she hadn't come to be saved. She had come to remind him. 3 nights before her appearance, Father Brown had returned from visiting a parishioner on the edge of town. A storm was coming in, the sky an angry bruised color, the wind whispering across the hedgerows like it carried secrets. He had taken the longer path, through the woods behind the church, where the ground sagged unnaturally and the trees never lost their leaves, even in winter. He had passed the ruins of the old chapel, the one burned during the riots, the one no one ever visited anymore, and there, just for a second, he had seen movement, a figure, small, watching. He hadn't thought much of it. Then, just a trick of the light, the storm, the hour. But now, remembering her words, "I saw what you buried," he felt something ancient shift beneath his ribs. Years ago, before the war, there had been another case, one the church never recorded. A girl had gone missing. Amelia Harrow. She was quiet, bright, and disappeared during a church-sponsored field trip to the countryside. Search parties found nothing. No trace, not a footprint, not a cry. Her parents, parishioners of St. Mary's, moved away 2 months later, unable to bear the silence. But Father Brown had never forgotten, because 1 week after her disappearance, he had found something. A rosary, half buried in the woods, still warm. Wrapped around it, a scrap of white cloth embroidered with a single letter, A. He had brought it to the bishop. The bishop had burned it in front of him and told him, "There are sins the earth must keep, Father. Not all graves need stones." He had never spoken of it since, until now, until the girl who looked like Amelia but wasn't. The villagers called her Ash, a name whispered behind cupped hands. Some said she was mad, others possessed. But the children said something else, something that made Father Brown's blood turn to ice. "She sleeps with her eyes open," one boy said. "She talks to someone no one else sees," another whispered. "She hums in Latin," said a third, "even though she's never been to school." And every morning when she sat beneath the old elm outside the chapel, she carved the same symbol into the soil, a cross, with its arms upside down. He tried to speak with her again, brought her bread, water, and a prayer card. She ignored the food, took the card, and held it to her chest. Then, without looking up, she said, "The girl you buried isn't sleeping." That night, the chapel doors blew open in the windless dark. Candles relit themselves. The bell rang once, even though the rope had been cut years ago, and on the altar lay a single white shoe, small, laced, muddied, with a faint crimson thread sewn through its sole. He didn't sleep, he didn't pray, he simply sat in the dark and waited for the question that was already forming in the pit of his soul. What did I fail to see that night? The next morning, Ash was gone, vanished, no prints, no signs of departure, just her carvings, deeper now. Not only the cross, but words, Latin, custodivit, vidit, taquit. He guarded, he saw, he was silent. Father Brown collapsed. 3 days later, he woke in the infirmary, fevered and trembling. The nurse said he'd been muttering things in his sleep, names, places, but one phrase repeated over and over. The witness is the grave. The bishop came, demanded silence, warned him of madness, and then handed him something wrapped in linen, an envelope. Inside, a letter, undated, unnamed. But the writing was his own. He recognized the hand. Shaky, rushed. If you're reading this, then she's found her way back. I tried to bury what I knew, what I saw, but the ground was too shallow. She was never meant to be forgotten. She was meant to be remembered, and it stopped there. No signature, no ink left, just a final mark, a circle, and inside it, a single eye, wide, watching. He returned to the woods that evening, not as a priest, but as a man who had run from truth for too long. The ground where the chapel once stood was sunken. The trees were silent. He dug, with his hands, no shovel, no blessing, just dirt, nails, tears, and he found it. A second rosary, wrapped in hair, still warm, still breathing, and beneath it, bone, tiny, fragile, children's teeth, placed in the shape of a cross. Then he heard it. Behind him, a footstep, a breath, a whisper. I saw what you buried. He turned, and Ash was standing there, but her eyes were empty sockets, and her smile was the exact same as Amelia Harrow's. He didn't scream, he just fell to his knees and whispered, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Then she vanished, just like before, and the woods closed in, swallowing the light. Chapter 8. Her crime began with shovel. She only meant to dig a flower bed, but when her spade hit something that moaned, she kept digging, because the voice in the soil said her name. It was a quiet morning in Kembleford, the kind of stillness that only comes before something is about to go terribly wrong. Mrs. Lydia Halbrook was tending her garden just past dawn, sleeves rolled, hair pinned, humming a hymn she barely believed in. The roses had died months ago, and she had told the village it was from frost, but Father Brown had walked past her gate just days earlier and noticed something else. The ground didn't freeze that deep, not in March, and the dead roots weren't black from cold. They were red. She'd started digging before sunrise. No one saw. No one heard. But a passing milkman said he caught a glimpse of her from the lane, standing still, her shovel stuck in the ground, her eyes fixed on something below as if it were whispering up to her. By the time Father Brown arrived that morning to return a borrowed hymnal, she was in the back garden again, her apron filthy, her hands trembling, but the roses were blooming now, suddenly, impossibly, and there was blood beneath her nails. She offered him tea, poured it carefully, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. Her hands never stopped shaking. The priest, gentle as ever, only asked one question. Did you find what you were looking for? Her cup shattered before she answered. That evening, the church bell rang 9 times. Not the usual call to mass. 9 distinct uneven chimes, like a message only one man could understand. And Father Brown did. Because in the chapel's vestry, where the old ledger was kept, he found the register open. A single name, written in a hand that hadn't touched the book in over 20 years. Eleanor M. Halbrook, dead, buried, forgotten, until now, Lydia's sister, or so the village once believed. But no obituary had ever run. No body had ever been viewed. Only a closed casket and a weeping husband, who vanished 1 year later, and a silence so complete it turned to myth. But Father Brown remembered the funeral, vividly, because he was the one who had delivered the eulogy. And yet, He'd never seen the face of the woman he was mourning. He returned to Lydia's that night, found her sitting by the garden, silent, pale. The earth beside the rosebush looked recently disturbed, again, and the scent of lilies was too strong, too sweet, as if trying to cover something that didn't want to stay hidden. He asked her again, gently, "Did you find her?" Lydia looked at him then, with eyes that no longer seemed her own. She wouldn't stay quiet, Father. Even after all these years, she kept speaking. He paused. "Eleanor," Lydia laughed, not with joy, not with madness, with guilt. "Not Eleanor, the other one." And then she stood up and walked inside, leaving the door open behind her, and did not return. That night, the wind howled across the moors. Chimneys sang, doors creaked, and in the chapel, someone left a note beneath the statue of St. Jude. 3 words, carved into the parchment by something sharp. "Look beneath me." Father Brown waited until morning. Then he returned to Lydia's garden and began to dig. He didn't expect what he found. It wasn't a coffin. It wasn't bones. It was a book, wrapped in velvet, stained, locked, no key, just initials burned into the cover. EMH. He brought it back to the rectory, prayed over it, then opened it with a blade. Inside were pages and pages of letters, confessions, written by Eleanor herself. But they weren't addressed to Lydia. They were addressed to someone else. A woman named Miriam. Someone no one in the village had ever heard of. Someone Eleanor described in fevered, terrified handwriting. "She watches from the mirror. She walks when I sleep." Lydia says she's only a dream, but I saw her bury something in the garden, something that looked like me. And then, halfway through the book, the pages stopped, torn out, ripped violently, but tucked into the binding was a single black and white photograph. 2 girls, identical, smiling, standing in the garden near the roses. But on the back, only one name, Miriam Holbrook, 1912. Not Eleanor, not Lydia. And now there were too many names, too many sisters, too many graves that didn't exist. Father Brown confronted Lydia. She didn't speak, only wept, then handed him something wrapped in cloth, a ribbon, faded, blood-stained, still warm. He asked, "Who was she?" Lydia whispered, "She was me." Then she collapsed, and when she woke, she no longer remembered who she was. The doctor said it was trauma, hysteria, a breakdown. But Father Brown knew better, because in the earth outside her window, the rose bush bloomed black the next morning, and carved into the bark of the tree behind it, a message appeared overnight. "You buried the wrong sister." That evening, he returned to the garden for the 3rd and final time, dug again, deeper, past roots, past rock, and there, finally, a box, wooden, rotten, inside it, a mirror, cracked, and behind the glass, a reflection that wasn't his, a face, smiling, and the voice of a woman, faint, whispering through the cold. "She started it with a shovel, Father, but I never stopped digging." He dropped the box, ran, and never returned to that garden again. To this day, the roses grow without water. And sometimes, in the church confessional, Father Brown hears a voice say, "She dug me up." But when he opens the door, no one is there. And when asked about the Holbrook sisters, he says only this, "I know who committed the crime, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 9. The evidence she thought hidden. She burned the letters, scrubbed the walls, buried the locket in a place no one would ever find. And still, when she looked in the mirror, the bruises spelled his name. It had been 10 years since the death of Gregory Whitmore, the brilliant but reclusive painter who vanished one storm-drenched night and was later found floating in the mill pond, face half gone, hands bound in silk. Officially, it had been ruled a suicide, depression, genius, alcohol, a narrative as convenient as it was hollow. But Father Brown had never believed it. Not then. Not now. Because he remembered something that no one else had bothered to ask. Why would a man kill himself with his hands tied? The Whitmore estate had sat empty since the funeral, its shutters drawn, its garden overgrown, its windows blind and cold. Until this week, when Eleanor Whitmore, Gregory's widow, returned, alone, quiet, changed. She told the villagers she was only there to sell the property, to close the final chapter. But Father Brown, who watched people more closely than they ever realized, noticed the tremor in her voice and the way she flinched when her own footsteps echoed too loudly. She walked like someone trying not to wake the house. 3 nights after her return, the constable received an anonymous note slipped under his door. It contained no greeting, no explanation, just 3 words written in a tight, shaking hand. Check the cellar. By morning, the constable had visited the estate and declared it undisturbed. But Father Brown knew better, because he saw the constable's eyes as he left, not confused, but afraid. The priest paid a visit to Eleanor that evening. She was cordial, even charming, and offered him tea in the drawing room where Gregory's final portrait still hung, unfinished, with the face erased. When he asked if she'd been sleeping well, she paused, and her fingers tightened around the cup. "Not quite," she said. "The house creaks. Sometimes it feels like it's remembering something." Father Brown asked if she remembered it too. She smiled, but her lips didn't move. That night, a fire broke out in the old tool shed behind the Whitmore house. It was extinguished quickly by the gardener, but not before it consumed everything inside: ledgers, paintings, and an antique chest filled with yellowed envelopes and photographs. Only one item was spared from the flames: a scorched page from a diary. One line survived. "He told me the blood would never dry if I kept the locket." By morning, Eleanor was gone. The house was empty again. But this time, there was something different, something missing. A priest's instinct is part intuition, part observation. Father Brown knew what to look for, not what was present, but what had been erased. He returned to the estate alone, entered through the kitchen door, and stood in the hallway where the wallpaper had been, stripped just recently. The faint smell of bleach still clung to the air. He followed it, to the staircase, to the cellar. The door had been bricked shut, roughly, recently, and scratched into the surface, almost invisible under the plaster dust, was the faint outline of a word. Forget. He returned to the rectory, spent hours poring over old church records, police reports, forgotten letters, and slowly the fragments began to take shape, not into a picture, but into a whole, a gap where a person had once existed. Her name was Claire, no last name, no birth record, but referenced once in a side note from Gregory's art dealer, who mentioned a model, a muse, whom he had painted obsessively during his final year. She had vanished just days before his death. No search was made, no questions asked, because Gregory had told them she'd never existed. But one photograph survived, torn, faded: Gregory, Claire, and Eleanor. 3 figures, smiling, one of them erased in pencil. The back read, "She knows too much." Father Brown revisited the cellar that night. He returned with gloves, a lantern, and a crowbar. The bricks came loose easier than they should have. The air behind the wall was cold, too cold, and dry. Inside, there was no room, no shelves, just a hollow and a box, small, wooden, bound in wire. Inside it, a locket, still warm, still damp. Inside the locket, 2 photographs, Gregory and Claire. On the back of hers, I begged her not to do it. He turned it over and saw, scratched into the metal, a second layer, a date, the day after Gregory's supposed suicide, meaning Claire had been alive after he died, or someone wanted them to believe she was. The next morning, Eleanor returned to the chapel, silent, pale. She approached Father Brown with shaking hands, holding a note. She didn't speak, just pressed it into his palm. It read, "She made me watch, then made me forget. But the locket remembers. She collapsed before he could ask another question, was rushed to hospital, unconscious, and when the doctors cut away her blouse, they found bruises in the shape of fingerprints, tiny ones. That night, Father Brown locked the locket in the church safe, but it didn't stay there. By dawn, it was gone, and in its place, a note. The evidence she thought hidden was inside her all along. He turned, and in the mirror above the altar, the locket was there, worn around his neck, though he hadn't touched it. And in the reflection behind him, a woman stood, smiling, mouth stitched shut, eyes wide, and Father Brown whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Then the mirror cracked. Chapter 10. Father Brown followed her silence. She hadn't spoken a word in 13 years, but when Father Brown stepped into the corridor behind her and heard no footsteps, only the sound of breathing that didn't belong to either of them, he knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. It began with a whisper that wasn't a whisper at all, a sound not made by lips but by something older, something that lives between silence and speech. The girl's name was Margaret Wren, a recluse, a once promising pianist who stopped performing the moment her sister died during a recital at the age of 16. Since that day, Margaret had not spoken, not once, not to doctors, not to police, not even to God, at least not out loud. She arrived at St. Mary's without warning, barefoot and unannounced, her dress torn at the hem and her hands covered in what at first looked like paint, but smelled like iron. She said nothing, simply walked into the nave, sat in the front pew, and stared at the crucifix as if daring it to blink. Father Brown, who had been in the sacristy preparing for evening mass, watched her from behind the curtain. There was nothing especially frightening about the girl, and yet something about the way the air changed around her, like a bell ringing underwater, made him pause. She remained seated through the entire service. After the final blessing, as the congregation filed out, she still didn't move. When Father Brown approached her and gently asked if she needed help, she didn't speak, but her eyes turned towards the organ pipes, and for a moment, Father Brown felt the impossible sensation that they were echoing, without being played. That night, she was offered a bed in the rectory's spare room. She accepted without a word, nodded once, and walked toward it like someone who already knew the way. Father Brown stood at the door and watched her lie down, fully clothed, arms at her sides, eyes still open. She slept that way, watching the ceiling, breathing soundlessly, but it wasn't until the second night that things began to change. She left the room just after midnight, walked into the chapel barefoot, and stood beneath the stained glass window of St. Cecilia, the patron saint of music, and some whispered of unspeakable sorrow. Father Brown watched from the loft, unsure why he had awoken, unsure why he had followed her. She didn't know he was there, but something strange happened then. She tilted her head upward and began to move her hands, slowly, delicately, as if playing something invisible. The movements were exact, not random, notes formed in the silence. She was miming a sonata, one that Father Brown had heard before, one that her sister had died performing. He stepped forward, slowly, unsure what to say. But the moment his foot creaked on the balcony floorboard, she stopped, turned, and stared directly into his eyes. He said her name, and she smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, but like someone who knew what came next. The next morning, he found a folded piece of sheet music tucked under the statue of the Virgin Mary. The same sonata, the same notations, but the final measure was scratched out violently, over and over again, in thick black ink. On the reverse, written in careful childish script, "I saw what she played." He asked Margaret about it at breakfast. She said nothing, but she handed him a photograph. Old, curled at the edges, two girls, twins, one holding a violin, the other standing beside her with hands tucked in her coat. Behind them stood a house, a manor by the looks of it, large, grey, with only one visible window. Father Brown had never seen either girl smile like that. He flipped the photo, no caption, only a symbol, a treble clef carved into the paper with something sharp, and beneath it, the word silence. He went to the manor 2 days later. It was real, long abandoned, overgrown ivy, broken fences, but still standing. According to parish records, it had belonged to the Wren family for over a century. The last resident, Margaret's mother, had passed years ago. The estate left to Margaret. No one had entered it since, except Margaret had been there. Recently, because in the garden was a new grave, unmarked, fresh. Father Brown didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he followed the path to the conservatory, where the glass was shattered and the piano sat rotting beneath vines. Sheet music still rested on the stand. The same sonata, but rewritten in someone else's hand. More rushed, erratic, and smeared with something dark. He opened the lid of the piano. Inside, where strings should have been, were teeth, human teeth, hundreds, arranged in neat rows. He stumbled back, choking on breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And then he saw her, Margaret, standing in the hallway, behind the glass, watching, no expression, no fear, just waiting. When he returned to St. Mary's, she was already there, seated in the same pew, same position. But this time, something was in her lap, a journal. She didn't hand it to him, just slid it across the pew when he sat beside her. He opened it. Inside were pages filled with one phrase, over and over. She played the silence wrong. Then a drawing of a girl, alone, surrounded by figures with no mouths, only ears, dozens of them, and beneath a final scrawled line, "Father, I didn't stop her. That's why they follow me now." He looked up. Margaret was gone. The door hadn't opened. The candles were still lit, but the pew was empty, and the journal had vanished. He went back to the grave. This time, he dug. He had to know. He had to see. Beneath 2 feet of soil, he found the casket, and inside, a violin, cracked in half, a rosary, snapped, and a mouthpiece, the kind used for piano tuning, jammed through a cloth doll's throat. No body, just objects, arranged like a ritual or a warning. He returned to the chapel, but the stained glass had changed. St. Cecilia's face was missing, replaced by a mirror, and in the reflection, Margaret stood, eyes black, mouth sewn, and the sound of that unfinished sonata began to play, without instruments, without source, from nowhere, from everywhere. He whispered, "Margaret?" But it wasn't her voice that answered, it was her sister's. "You followed her silence, Father. But now you must hear what was buried." Then the candles blew out. All at once, the journal reappeared at his feet, with one final line, freshly written. The last note was mine. He closed it and whispered, "I know who played it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 11. She dug. He didn't blink. She drove the shovel into the earth so hard it cracked bone, and Father Brown, standing just a few feet away, never flinched, never stopped watching, never spoke a word. It had been raining for 3 days when Agnes Bell returned to Kembleford. She arrived by the back road, dressed in black from boots to bonnet, dragging behind her a rusted wheelbarrow wrapped in a tarp no one dared ask about. The villagers hadn't seen her in over a decade, not since the trial, not since the fire, not since the night her husband disappeared and her child went silent forever. She'd left under suspicion, under shadow, under the kind of silence that made people say, "Poor thing," even when they really meant guilty. But now she was back, and no one understood why. Father Brown was the only one who met her, at the edge of town. He hadn't sent for her, hadn't expected her. But something in the weight of the storm, the way the wind turned suddenly colder, as she approached, told him this wasn't a visit. It was a reckoning. She said nothing as she passed him, only glanced sideways with the look of a woman who carried things not even the grave could keep. He followed, quietly, at a distance, not out of suspicion, but out of instinct, because sometimes God's work is not in the chapel, but in the shadows we're meant to stand inside without interfering. She walked all the way to the old orchard, the one behind the abandoned rectory, the one where the weeds grew too tall, and the earth always seemed too soft, as if it was never finished swallowing. She stood at the edge of a particular tree, a twisted ash that looked more like a wound than a plant, and set the wheelbarrow down. Then she began to dig, and Father Brown didn't stop her. He didn't ask why, because he already knew this was not the first time this earth had been opened. The rain didn't touch her. It fell all around, soaking the leaves, splattering the dirt, but not a single drop struck her coat or her bonnet. She dug with slow, violent force, each strike of the shovel deeper, faster, more desperate. And then finally, the sound changed. From earth to wood. She stopped. Her hands trembled. And that's when she looked at Father Brown. The first words she'd spoken in 12 years came like a confession. "They told me the box was empty." And Father Brown, without blinking, simply said, "It never was." She knelt then, brushed away the soil. The outline of a small crate appeared, rotted, splintered, too fragile to lift. She didn't open it at first, just stared. They said it burned, that the fire took everything, that there was nothing left to find. Father Brown said nothing, because he remembered the night of the fire. He remembered the smoke curling above the churchyard. He remembered the screams, not loud ones, but muffled, the kind that got caught in the walls, in the skin. He remembered her husband, Thomas Bell, standing in the doorway of their home, soaked in lamp oil, staring at something in his hands. He remembered the next morning, Thomas gone, Agnes in shock, and the baby's cradle empty. Agnes reached into the hole and removed the crate. It made a sound, a soft, rattling sound. She peeled back the lid, and inside was a doll, blackened, wrapped in a child's blanket, still warm, still breathing. No, not breathing, but something was moving inside it. She dropped the box and stepped back, gasping. Father Brown knelt, picked up the doll, unwrapped it, and there, nestled within the folds of fabric, was a second item, a photograph, faded, torn, 2 children, not one, twins, but only one ever had a name. The other had been hidden, unspoken, unblessed, because Agnes Bell had only registered 1 child with the parish, only held 1 christening, only buried 1 coffin, but 2 had been born, and now the other had come back, not in flesh, not in voice, but in silence, in Agnes's mind, in the soil, in the screams she hadn't heard but had buried anyway. Agnes dropped to her knees, sobbing. I didn't know he took her." Father Brown's voice was steady. "You knew, but they convinced you not to remember, not to feel." She screamed. It wasn't loud, but it broke something. The sky opened, thunder rolled, and from within the earth came a sound that neither of them could explain. A baby's cry, from deep below, but too slow, too twisted, too late. Agnes threw the doll into the grave and began to cover it again, fast, panicked, as if trying to silence it once more. But Father Brown reached out and stopped her hand. "You can't bury what you haven't faced." She looked up, eyes wild. What else was I supposed to do? And then she said something else, something that made Father Brown go still. "He made me choose." The words hung there, rotting, and everything that had once been speculation became horrifyingly clear. Thomas Bell hadn't vanished. He had switched the twins. In the fire, in the chaos, he'd taken one, hidden her, left the other, the wrong one buried, the other raised like a ghost, and Agnes had been made to believe it never happened, that the baby died, that her silence was grief, when it had always been fear. She pointed to the photograph. "That's her, the one they said never lived." Father Brown turned it over, and there, faintly written in the corner, were 2 initials, a B and T, B, Agnes Bell, Thomas Bell, and between them, a scribbled third, JB, a name never spoken, a sister never baptized, a soul never given rest. The grave shook, not from anything beneath, but from the weight of truth. And Agnes whispered, she never wanted to be found. She wanted to be named. Father Brown pulled from his coat a small vial of holy water. He blessed the grave, spoke her name for the first time. "Josephine Bell, may your silence end." And just like that, the wind stopped, the trees held their breath, and the earth at last went still. Agnes collapsed into his arms, and Father Brown whispered the final line he always saved for moments like this. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. Grave dirt covered her secret. When they exhumed the wrong coffin and found her locket inside the ribcage, Father Brown didn't speak. Instead, he fell to his knees and whispered the name no one else knew she'd hidden beneath the cross. It had begun as a quiet storm. Not the kind that thunders and howls, but the kind that settles into the bones, crawling through fog and old stone like a warning. The funeral was small. Closed casket. No choir. Just a cold drizzle and a nervous family whispering about inheritance and whispers best forgotten. Mildred Huxley, matriarch of the village, had passed in her sleep at 87. They said it was peaceful. They said it was natural. But Father Brown saw the tremble in the undertaker's hands and the pale look on the housekeeper's face. Someone had buried more than a body. He had known Mildred for decades, stern, composed, ruthlessly elegant, the type of woman who made you feel as though you'd sinned just by standing in her drawing room. But there was always something beneath the surface, a restlessness. She confessed rarely and never fully. When she did, her voice would soften just slightly when she spoke of her brother Peter, a boy who died young, supposedly in the war, though his name was never listed in the records. No grave, no photographs, no one had even seen him. And when Father Brown had asked her once, very gently, why his name was never mentioned, she replied with one line that haunted him now. Some deaths are quieter than silence. The grave was freshly dug, the headstone not yet carved. As the villagers filed away, Father Brown remained, watching the soil settle. But something caught his attention, something almost imperceptible. A glint, just beyond the mound, a small metal tag, half buried in mud. He bent down, brushed it clean. A dog tag, Peter Huxley. But it wasn't worn. It was polished, new. It had been placed there, recently, by someone who wanted it to be found. He took it back to the rectory, cleaned it, and opened the parish records. Peter Huxley had no death certificate, no military records, no baptism entry, but one document stood out, an old census form from 1904, 2 children listed, Mildred and Peter, ages 10 and 8. The form was updated 5 years later, and Peter's name was gone, not crossed out, erased. That night, the church bell rang 13 times. No wind, no rope, and at the foot of the altar, someone left a note. Just 5 words. Look where she was baptized. He returned to the old chapel the next morning, the one on the edge of the village, abandoned since the fire of 31. It had been Mildred's childhood parish. Most of the building had collapsed, but the font remained, stone, unmoved, cracked at the base. He opened it. Inside was dirt, not ash, not rubble, soil, burial soil. He dug, and inside he found a small tin box, a locket, a lock of hair, and a letter, yellowed with time. The handwriting was delicate. Mildred, I forgive you, but I won't stay silent forever. The signature, P.H., Peter Huxley, still alive. He staggered back, breath frozen. Then he heard it, a voice, low, hollow, behind him. You should have left her buried. Father Brown turned, but no one was there. The next morning, a grave in the cemetery was dug up, but it wasn't Mildred's. It was the plot, beside her, one that had been empty, or so they thought. Inside was a skeleton, wrapped in an old church banner. Fingernails broken, jaw twisted open, and in the chest cavity, that locket, the same one from the tin, opened now. Inside, a photograph, 2 children, one smiling, the other not. On the back, a message. She said no one would miss me. She was right, until now. The village erupted. Whispers spread like fire. Had Mildred buried her own brother? Was he alive all along? Or had he been hidden beneath their feet for 70 years? The constable wanted answers, but Father Brown said nothing. He visited the grave one last time. Kneeling between the two plots, he brushed the dirt gently, and beneath it, carved into the wood of Mildred's coffin, was a message. Fresh. Don't open me. You won't like what you find. He stood in silence for a long time. The sun never broke through the clouds. And in the wind, he heard her voice. Some secrets are only safe when buried. He turned, walked away, and when the constable asked him what was found in that coffin, he simply said, "I know what she hid, but the truth will never be told."